Okay, well, here we are. We're doing part 2 of our Q&A, Nate,
Yep.
just because the last one went so long, and I can see there's several questions to go. So
There are. I knew we were too long-winded to keep it to one.
That's right. So the question we were dealing with had to do with, okay, the animals coming to the Ark. Well, if you got one continent, that's easy for them to come. But a question we often get, and one was posed to me last night, is, well, how do we explain how the animals came from the mountains of Ararat, where they got off the Ark, to go all the way around the world?
Right.
Because today we see continents that are separated. So, you'll often hear it said this way: how did the kangaroos get to Australia? Did they just hop, kind of thing? And the answer is yes. But anyway, it needs to be a little bit deeper than that. So I think a key issue that many Christians haven't really contended with is the concept of the Ice Age. See, biblical creationists believe in an Ice Age. We just don't believe in the evolutionary timescale.
Right.
But I encourage people just to go, on Google and put up map of the Ice Age. And what you'll see is a world map, and they'll show what the continents are today, and they'll show how far the continents spread out and how connected they are at the height of the Ice Age. Now, understand, for people that are listening, an Ice Age doesn't mean the whole Earth is covered in ice.
Right.
It means that, the glaciers started and grew, came to a certain point, and then retreated.
That's right.
Right?
Which, just as a side note, which is worth talking about with the sort of climate alarmism that is all over the world right now, talking about the moving glaciers and such.
Right.
The recognition that glaciers have moved throughout history and life has survived through history is actually an important feature of understanding.
There's some cyclical things or
it's worth mentioning, but continue.
Sure. Yeah. So what you'll see is at the height of the Ice Age, the continents are actually all connected. So there's land bridges, we'll call them, between there, which gives you an understanding of how the creatures could have spread out from one central point all over. You see, you need 2, at least, very specific mechanisms in order to create an Ice Age. So some people have proposed, perhaps the sun was a little cooler in the past and that caused an Ice Age. Well, it's not going to work. It would create a frozen, barren tundra on the Earth. What's so specific about the Ice Age is you needed these glaciers to grow, right?
Yep.
And so that meant, where'd the water come from? At the height of the Ice Age, there was a lot of water on the Earth in the form of ice and snow. So that came from our oceans. Well, then what would cause that? You need 2 things. You need warmer oceans. You need cooler land masses. What event could have provided those 2 things? The flood.
Right.
Because again, we've talked about the fountains of the Great Deep bursting open. That alludes to a lot of tectonic activity. And so you look at things like Mount St. Helens, for example. When Mount St. Helens blew up in 1980, we were getting cloud cover in southern Ontario here because of all the ash and dust that was thrown up into the air. And that's just one little volcano. So you picture at the time of the flood, if there was a lot of that activity, at the end of the flood, you've got the perfect situation to start an Ice Age cycle because the oceans are now slightly warmer because of the tectonic activity, and you've got a lot of this dust going up. As a matter of fact, I think it was about 9 years ago now, a volcano blew up. I think it was in Iceland. And the planes, they had to stop planes from going through that area because the dust and stuff was gumming up the engines.
Oh, interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't just gum up engines. It reflects sunlight. It makes the area cooler, right? It changes the temperature. So a lot of precipitation happens when you've got warmer oceans. But when it falls, it forms in the form of snow, ice, etc. That's going to set up that cycle where all of a sudden the glaciers start to grow, gets to a certain peak, that dust finally dissipates, and all of a sudden it starts to retreat. So the flood has great explanatory power for not only the Ice Age, the physical evidence of an Ice Age, which is things like till deposits and moraines.
Yep.
You ever been driving along and you look out into a field and it's so flat, and all of a sudden there's this big chunk of boulder there, and you're like, that fall out of the sky. No, it probably, as the glaciers retreated, it melts and it drops this stuff because as it's building, it's actually scouring up stuff. It's getting caught up into the ice, and as it melts, it drops it down. So that's the physical evidence, and rocks having been scraped over one another, etc. So it explains the Ice Age, but it also explains animal dispersion. The fact that from one central point, when all the continents are interconnected, the creatures could have spread out randomly and went to different places. As far as the speed, because a lot of times people were like, yeah, but how fast can creatures go? I just picked up 2 examples, both from Australia. And the first is rabbits in Australia. So prior to 1788, they didn't have rabbits in Australia. And then they started bringing them over. Well, let me see. I'll just go through it real quick here and give you so basically in 51 years, rabbits from one central point in Australia have spread out over the entire continent. Now, when I went to Australia, I was kind of surprised because in my head, I was like, oh, that's that island down right down there. If you look at the landmass of Australia, it basically fits on top of Canada. Like it's huge. It's a huge place. So in less than 51 years, you've got a species get introduced and they flood the entire continent, right? You're talking centuries and centuries after the Ark lands that creatures could have spread out all over the earth. Another example was cane toads. And we're talking toads now. So in March 1937, they introduced cane toads into Australia to eat some kind of beetle that was, affecting crops or something. Well, they gave themselves a huge headache because these toads now, which are poisonous, have spread out, and by today, 2022, they've spread out over 2/3 of the landmass of Australia. Toads, like.
Yep.
Right? You're talking, they're
not the fastest moving things.
Exactly. So it's actually quite easy to understand once you understand that ice age component and the fact that the land bridges would have been there and so on, how you could explain animal dispersion from one central point.
And I think again, this is what I've joked throughout this series sometimes that in some cases, Sunday school flannel graph charts and pictures have not done us any help. Not only does it often show the time prior to the flood, very primitive, which I think we have a question about that, so we can get to that later. But but you also have this sort of Noah comes out, and there's this this almost paradise, right? He's stepping out into a new Eden. Right. But you alluded to this in our first video, and I think it's important to note that Noah came out to a devastated earth, death, and destruction, and just a totally we have to remember that the flood was God's judgment. And so God's wrath was poured out on the earth at that time, and Noah was walking out into a devastated earth. And so the idea that he's walking out into an earth with all kinds of dust and stuff in the atmosphere that would cause an ice age, and the hardship that would create for humans, for plants, for animals, was massive. And that shouldn't surprise us based on what the history of the event is that this is God pouring out judgment on the earth. So
their hearts became evil and wicked. That's all they were thinking about. It was just an evil place. So God's judgment on it. You're right. People have this idea of him walking out in fully grown trees and all that stuff. It would have taken a while for the earth to come to the point it is. Heal is exactly right. But you still see the wounds, quote unquote.
Yeah.
I've flown across the Badlands. When you head out to Alberta and stuff like that, and you're flying over and you look down, and I'm like, there was a massive amount of water that just scoured you can see it. The features are still there.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're going to jump into some other questions, different categories here. So I'm going to read the 3 questions together because they all kind of can be answered with the same general idea.
They're about vegetation,
They're about vegetation, yeah. So I'll just read them together so we're honoring each person's question. There are some slight variations, but we'll kind of answer these things together. So the first one is, how do I answer the question of how the vegetation survived the flood to skeptics? I know Noah would have gathered seeds of everything, but how did the dove bring back an olive leaf after the floods had subsided? Next question is, if all the land was submerged for all that time, how did the non-aquatic vegetation survive? The dove brought back an olive twig so that that olive tree was thriving, and in leaf as the water subsided. Plants that grow on dry land can only survive for a short time underwater. And the last question, God preserved each kind of animal, but were there vegetation types that did not survive the flood? So there's a couple variations there, but we're talking about vegetation. Yep. How did the vegetation survive? How is it that there was this seemingly thriving olive tree that the dove brought back? Right. And then the question is, was there vegetation that did not survive the flood? So
yeah. So right off the bat, I would definitely say there's good evidence that many plants did not survive the flood.
Right.
Species that we see in the fossil record don't seem to be represented today. Okay. So
this comes back to God's judgment, a devastated earth, yep. And there was a lot of death and a lot of destruction.
Yeah, you don't see anywhere in the flood narrative where God says, Noah, I want you to collect,
all the seeds.
10 seeds of everything right. I've created, right? That wasn't part of the thing, which contributes to the fact that we live in a devastated world, that we're now deprived of some things that used to be on Earth that are no longer, and contributes to some of the problems. So
that's a good point.
You've mentioned a couple of times in your sermon about mosquitoes, right? Like why did God, create or preserve mosquitoes? Kind of fits into here. Most people don't understand that it's only the female mosquito that bites you.
Yeah.
And she only does so when she's trying to produce eggs and stuff like that, because she needs more protein. So the male, he doesn't bother doing that. Normally mosquitoes just eat nectar, yep. Right? They go over to flowers and plants and they use their proboscis in that way. But when she needs protein to produce eggs to reproduce, you're a ready target. So she comes along and uses the equipment that she was originally created for a different purpose. Now today there are some plants like beans, for example. You can get protein out of kidney beans and stuff yep. like that. But perhaps the food source that she needed from plants, maybe they didn't survive the flood. So now it's part of the curse, and we've got to deal with these things, and we get attacked.
And just as a side note, it is interesting that, and I'm going to get into this this week, God actually opens up the protein of animal
exactly.
meat post-flood.
That's right.
Right. So the joke is always, Adam's diet was a vegetarian diet, right? But God opens up at post-flood. Well, now you may eat animals, and yep. He says you can't mix it with
As
their blood.
I gave you the green plants, I now give you.
That's right. And so there's something that it seems nutritionally that was lost from the vegetation that now needs to be supplemented by people eating meat.
Correct.
And as much as we might like steak, that is a result of the curse, right? Because this is life-taking life as opposed to eating
Correct.
vegetation and nuts. And
Genesis 1:29 and 30 said everything's eating plants in the beginning, the people and the beast of the earth.
That's right.
So we're picturing a future time, right? New heavens, new earth, where we're not going to be killing animals because it's brutal. I mean, as much as I like a good steak, I wouldn't want to go down to the slaughterhouse, watch them put a cow into the slot and take a bolt and drive it through its head prior to me eating my steak, because I like that separation of not having to think about that
yep.
while I just enjoy my steak, and you almost have to force yourself not to, because it's disgusting, really, because it's death and we don't like death and all those types of things. So yeah, I think that's a really good point you made. And it's also not just nutritionally, perhaps, but God wanting to preserve, people. Think about the people that were, the languages get confused and you're moving around the earth and then you get trapped in a very cold environment. So let's say you're an Inuit, right? And God says, no, you can't eat meat. Well, you're dead because there's not enough plants there to eat. Absolutely. So those are other things, but he wants to preserve people.
Life,
so
yeah.
Okay, so back to the idea of plants surviving and stuff like that. It was actually Charles Darwin that helped solve one of these questions.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah, because he did a lot of studies on taking plants, seeds, putting them in salt water and seeing if they could survive. And it's very interesting that some plant types, you put the seed in the water, and it basically has this genetic coding to just put this kind of coating around it that helps it survive.
Wow. And
then when you dry it out, it just bloom, and it'll activate and it starts sprouting. So
I wonder where along the evolutionary timeline the seeds developed the force field gene.
Well, exactly. And these are things that creationists point out. If the seed didn't have that mechanism, it doesn't reproduce. And is it an anticipatory thing? Is evolution thinking, well, maybe I should develop this thing
in case something I've never seen before?
Yes. Yeah. And so those are some good questions to ponder, and we have articles on it and stuff like that. So there's that concept. Many seeds, you think of the devastation that's caused by just local floods today, when, even 3 days of torrential rain and all the biomass and all the plants and stuff like that, it creates floating log mats. It creates whole groups of broken plants and trees and stuff like that, where animals have actually been shown to get trapped on, and then they separate from the land, and these animals are like on these little floating islands, and they'll arrive at another island, get off, and all of a sudden there's a new population start. And that's been observed in real time. So seeds and things like that also we're thinking survived that way. And then also many plants are capable of asexual sprouting that go on to produce seeds. And as far as the olive tree, because that's what people always bring up.
Times, yep.
Yeah. So olive trees are propagated commercially from cuttings. That's how they.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, for thousands of years now, they've done that, right? So you want an olive tree, they'll give you a cutting from an olive tree, because the olive tree is one of the hardiest of the horticultural plants on Earth, and so. We've got to remember too that there was an olive leaf that was brought back.
Yep.
Not a branch from not a big old branch from a fully mature tree, but think of one of these cuttings, right? Because all these broken up things and stuff like that, and the waters start to recede, and the pieces of plant fall down, and the cuttings there, and you get a leaf, and the dove brings it back, and Noah says, "Oh, okay, here's a sign that life has at least started to regenerate."
Well, and you notice that in the story, Noah doesn't get off the ark right away, so he doesn't say, "Oh, hey, there's fully formed trees for us to go and play in," right?
That's right.
He still waits after that.
Yeah, and this also brings up the concept of do we expect to find the ark? Well, personally, we don't. Okay, Answers in Genesis. That's one of the episodes I do on the Genesis account. 5 times the ark has been found. Well, guess what? It's never been found,
That's right.
And we don't think it would have been found, because as they get out of the ark, and okay, you've got some plants starting to regrow and stuff like that. They're probably still relying on food sources they brought with them. Of course, we would expect Noah to have brought a lot of seeds, because he's going to. Well, as a matter of fact, the Bible says he planted a vineyard.
That's right.
He
knew what was important.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, as a matter of fact, Proverbs talks about that, right? Cultivate your fields first, then build your home.
That's right.
And as they do start building their home, there's a whole bunch of hewn wood sitting there.
That's right.
So why wouldn't they just repurpose that, in the beginning for the first couple of years?
Building shelter, fires, all that stuff, right?
They're having babies. They're starting to repopulate.
Yeah,
They start
a lot of cribs.
Yeah, a lot of cribs. Things
Go
like
for
that.
wood cribs.
Yeah. Some plants, they like seeds require exposure to some light. They don't germinate if they don't have enough oxygen. So again, as the waters start to recede and all these bits of flotsam and jetsam, come down to the earth, that's where you're going to get your plants to come back. But I think some people's heads are just like, well, there's no way plants could have survived. No, there's demonstrable experiments, like I said, even by Charles Darwin, that have been done that demonstrate that no, they can last for very long periods in water.
And just to pay a compliment, Cal, hearing you talk about all this stuff is awesome. I love how much of this is in your mind, and obviously you're an expert in this field, and so you have a lot of this. This is what you do,
right?
But I just want to remind people, because they might be sitting there going but what are the chances Noah knew this about these seeds and this about? Remember that Noah is 600 years old when the flood came. And so he had a lot of experience. You think about the wisdom. You go talk to an old retired farmer, right? And you talk about the things they know that we don't know. Most of them are handymen. Most of them have they know plumbing, they know electrical.
Man.
They know, yeah, that's right. This whole modern idea of specialization is a modern concept, quite frankly. It used to be that people were much more generalists, but you can imagine if you lived over 600 years, what you would know about animal husbandry and botany and building and construction and all this kind of stuff, because not only was he 600 years old, but he was 600 years old in a body that was still strong and vibrant.
That's right.
And he was a man who walked with God, which means the beginning of wisdom. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, which means he was a wise man.
Yep.
And so what Noah knew, it probably far exceeds any of the doctors and PhDs or anybody that we know of today.
Well, absolutely. And you think of God coming along and saying to Noah, okay, I want you to build a boat. Here's how big it's going to be. Go for it. We don't see any further explanation.
Yeah.
And somehow Noah's like, okay, that's what I got to go do. I'm going to go do it. You're so correct. Think of how in what we observe today is somebody, they get one specialization and they ride that and then they die and that's it. So if you go to the Ark Encounter, again, they've kind of fleshed these ideas out a bit. And so there's one exhibit where, well, what might Noah have known? I mean, he was the man for the job, so to speak.
That's right.
So he probably had experience with animal husbandry. He probably had experience building, structures, wooden structures, all this type of stuff. So it's not... I think of that as kind of the greatest superhero. Like, think of it. If you could specialize in all these different things, like you would be Batman.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
That's
You'd have all these specialized skills because you just lived even 200 years. How much of an expert at any one thing would you be in comparison to any one of us today?
Well, and you think about just like we kind of are like, oh, wow, doctors go to school for so long. You're talking, what, 7 years?
14 years.
Yeah,
He
10
went to
years,
school.
whatever.
Yeah.
And so you think of a guy who's 600 years old, you can pick up, if you can get a doctorate nowadays in 10 years or less, what was he learning through the decades and decades of a sharp mind, a strong body? So I do think we have to remember that. That's a big part of the story.
Yeah, we tend to look at our environment, how we operate today, and then we transpose that on these Old Testament historical narratives and think, well, we couldn't do that. Well, we know.
That's why you live now and he lived then.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Because you wouldn't have built the boat and none of us would be here.
Exactly. By the way, I'd just like to mention, I mean, even though we're going, roughly an hour for these 2 episodes, the fact is all of these questions have been answered on the Answers in Genesis website. Many of the videos that we've done, help answer these questions in much more detail. So I often find if you've got a training in science, right, and you really want a deep dive, we've got very technical papers on this at the Answers in Genesis website as well. Yep. But again, like our previous Q&A video, I'll link some resources that people can check out.
Sounds good. Okay, so we got more generalized questions now. So the first one is, you mentioned in a previous sermon about Genesis that the earth may have had millions or possibly even billions of people already living on it and by the time the flood comes. 2 questions. What does Calvin and Answers in Genesis think about the population of the earth? So they're holding me accountable to what the experts think here, Cal, which is good. And secondly, with every person perishing in the flood, that would mean that there were lots of human remains around the water when the water receded. They could have been carried all over the earth as well. Over the years, have there been lots of bones, et cetera, recovered around the world, or how would you explain if there hadn't been? So again, does the geological record reflect the death that the narrative tells us about? Right. And how many people do you think died in all of that?
Yeah, and so I'm just going to be honest. If you'd asked me this question and I just said it off the cuff, I would have said, I don't know, maybe 10 million people or something like that. But in preparation for this, I decided, hey, let's go to the website of the ministry I represent and see what a great resource, and see what some smart people have thought of. And so the fact is, we don't know. Right. And so what really was represented there is that some people believe that the population was relatively low. Maybe it was like around 10 million, because the world that was described was a very evil, corrupt, possibly violent world. Mm-hmm. Perhaps a lot of wars happening. Again, you've got one continent. People, right?
Yeah,
people
can't get away too far.
There's nowhere to go.
Yeah.
And so perhaps it was, a little bit lower. Here's directly from one of the articles. Others believe the Earth's population was much higher. If the growth rate in the pre-flood world was equal to the growth rate in 2000, this article is written, there could have been about 750 million people at the time of the flood. Okay. And then it mentions, though, that, they had extremely long lifespans. So perhaps the growth rate could have been much higher, so that they set up to 4 billion. So really, it's like
10 million, 4 billion. You got a bit of discrepancy there, but
exactly, we don't know. But the second part of the question is the issue, whether it was 10 million or whether it was 4 billion. Where are the bodies? Is basically the question, right? So, first of all, what most people don't understand is the nature of the fossil record itself. So I'll just go through this so people can get an understanding, because there are tons of bones all around the world, billions of dead things buried in rock layers, as we'll say. But most people don't understand that 95% of the fossil record is of shallow marine organisms. Corals and shellfish. You go to Mexico and you just see this vast floodplain of sea life buried everywhere. Well, that makes up 95% of the fossil record.
Wow.
And so of the remaining 5%, 95% of that 5% consists of plants and trees and algae and stuff like that. So you very quickly start getting into the vertebrates, like things with bones in it. And that makes up 5% of the 5%. It's a mere 0.25% of the entire fossil record. So, of amphibians, reptiles, birds, and stuff like that, which are what we put in museums, you've got a very small percent of the fossil record. One of the things that was written here is that, for example, we've only ever found one fossilized stegosaurus skull. Out of all the stegosauruses we found, there's only that many. I think there's perhaps 11 or 12 tyrannosaurs, and those, they didn't find every bone, but they're pretty, good articulated skeletons. So here's what it comes down to. The amount of creatures in comparison to the amount of humans, we were a small part of. And in the fossil record, there's only a small representative of any vertebrates there anyway. And I thought this was very interesting. Only 1% of the 0.25% of the vertebrate fossils that we find have more than one bone.
Wow.
So when they find a dinosaur and it looks like pretty well together, that's why they're over the moon about it. It's just like, okay, this is so special. So we get into, first we understand that. Then I brought this quote in because I thought it was very interesting. So this is from my dinosaur presentation, and it's an interview with the creationist Dr. Carl Werner from his book, Living Fossils, Evolution, a Grand Experiment, where he's talking to a man named Dr. Donald Burge, who was the curator of vertebrate paleontology, okay, an evolutionist. And this is what the evolutionist said. We find mammals in almost all of our dinosaur dig sites. These were not noticed years ago. If people refer to part one of our conversation, I talked about how the fact they found beavers and ducks and badgers and platypus in the same layers as dinosaurs. So they coexisted even according to the evolutionists.
Right.
And this is a fellow that's confirming that, because most people aren't aware that dinosaurs lived with beavers, right?
Yep.
And then he says, we have about 20,000 pounds of bentonite clay that is mammal fossils we're just trying to give away to some researcher. It's not that they're not important. It's just that you only live once, and I specialize in something other than mammals. I specialize in reptiles and dinosaurs. I think this is a very
that's interesting,
illuminating quote.
Totally.
Here's what the evolutionist is saying. Yeah, we've got all sorts of mammals mixed in with dinosaurs, but I just look at the dinosaur bones. So they're not even correlating. One thing I've said from stage over for years now is I'm so looking for that next generation of Christian young people that really are gifted, scientifically, to get equipped with biblical apologetics so that they can go to university and withstand secular indoctrination, but get out into the field and see what is mixed with those bones that gives glory to God.
That's right.
And shows that God's word is true. So what I'm kind of getting at here is, these weren't noticed years ago. Well, why weren't they noticed? When I grew up and I was looking at dinosaur books, when I was an atheist, I loved dinosaurs and evolution. I knew all the stories and stuff. They never once mentioned there were mammals mixed in. Well, why didn't you notice them? You didn't notice them because you don't find what you're not looking for.
That's right.
Right? So now that it's just become obvious in a sense, it's just like, it's just too overwhelming. Oh, by the way, that we found beavers with dinosaurs. Okay. So,
Yeah. Can you put that in the next Jurassic Park, please?
that would be very interesting, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so here's another quote. For example, a 5 million year old piece of bone that was thought to be the collarbone of a human-like creature, they actually found out to be a dolphin rib. Okay. So again, you're not finding what you're not looking for. Okay. So we were looking for hominids. We were looking for ape men. So we found, oh no, it turns out to be a dolphin rib. So again, have we found human remains? I would say there's not one, rock solid case that you could sit down there and throw it out there. There have been some over the years that have been alluded to that might have some credibility to them, but a lot of times there's just not enough scientific evidence to make that bold claim. But anyway, yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at that because there have been some. You can find them in some of our articles that are alluded to, skeletons that were supposedly found in Cretaceous era rock. But some people could argue, well, maybe that's an intrusion. Maybe somebody buried them in there and stuff like that. So we really don't know.
What's interesting, though, is that, again, when you think through what the text actually says, you got to make sure that you're coming to the Bible first and then drawing your conclusions. So again, this was a cataclysmic event. There was a lot of violence, and again, Noah's walking off the earth and there's dead things everywhere, right? It's not that everything got buried, right? Not everything got buried in a catastrophic way where things got fossilized.
Exactly. And here's the thing, people are smart. And they're going to try to survive, and they're capable of survival the longest out of all the creatures, right? So the thing about bodies is they float and bloat in water. Yep. And those things that aren't buried, if you're floating on the surface, you just get destroyed and fall to pieces. That's why finding an articulated skeleton of anything is very, very rare.
Right.
Okay. So when you take up the amount of people that might have been there, so let's say it's 10 million, let's say it's 750 million. How many of them actually got buried? And then what people want to see is, look, here's a human skeleton and here's a dinosaur.
Riding one in.
That's what they want to find because they want that absolute solid evidence to prove it, right?
Right.
But years ago, I was talking to a geologist friend of mine who apparently had been in conversation with a evolutionist. And he'd asked the evolutionist, well, what would prove to you that evolution isn't true? And he said, if you could find a human footprint next to a dinosaur footprint, that'd do it for me. Well, years ago in the Paluxy River, creationists were showing pictures of what appeared to be to them human footprints and dinosaur footprints. Now, personally myself, having looked into it, and the Answers in Genesis Ministry looking into it, we don't give that any credence. Okay. We just don't think it's good enough evidence to. But many creationists have proven it. But at the time when this was being investigated, my friend talked to his evolutionary friend and just said, "So, what if this turns out to be true?" And the fella said, "Well, I've considered this, and I think if this turns out to be true, we'll have proven time travel."
Wow. Wow. Would rather believe in time travel than creation.
Well,
yeah.
Think it through though, right? Okay, we're evolving, we get smarter. In the future, we develop time travel. So then we get into a time machine, we go back and we visit the dinosaurs, we take off our flip-flops and we're, sliding around with it. And this brings out the nature of this whole creation evolution debate. Yeah. We're not talking about science, the type of science that determines like what water boils at sea level on the planet. You put the pot on, you put it in, and you repeat the experiment. We're looking at things in the present, trying to figure out what happened in the past. We're saying God's word is a reliable source of information. The evolutionists are making up a history as they go.
Yeah.
So God did also say that he was going to blot out man from the earth, right? And some people say, yeah, but the creatures and stuff. But man is accountable to God in a different way.
That's right.
Because of sin.
Yep.
Animals can act in a corrupted way, but we don't look at a great white shark and say, wow, look at how he's sinning right now, chomping on my leg. We're saying, no, we live in a sin-cursed world. Originally he wouldn't have been doing that, etc. So perhaps it just God wiped everything out. But I think it's more of a statistical thing. Comparison to the number of people to the number of animals on the planet at the time, which ones would have not got buried quickly. Because the reason why 95% of the fossil records of marine organisms is because that's what's going to get buried first. Mm-hmm. Right? Turbidity currents, things getting hit. Then you're going to get amphibians, and then it's kind of going to work up that scale to the creatures that are inland and stuff like that. And humans being able to cling to pieces of wood and all that kind of stuff. I wouldn't expect to find as many bodies of them. And like you said, you don't find what you're not looking for. So perhaps there have been things that have been found and just overlooked or not clearly seen yet. But I think it's more of a statistical thing in that sense.
Just a very small side note, again, in the text, it talks about how Noah first sent out a raven and then it was a dove. The raven goes to and fro, and it says that keeps doing that until the water subsided. So the raven didn't come back to Noah. And so you might ask the question, well, how long can a raven fly for? How many days was that? But very likely the raven found bodies floating on the top of the water that it could perch on. Ravens are carrion animals, and so that might have been the explanation as to how this raven was flying around for a couple weeks before before it found somewhere to land. And so you just look at those kinds of things like, well, what's the detail in there for the raven? I think there's some other symbolism there, but why is that detail even in there? And part of that is so that we can understand the amount of death and destruction that was just kind of floating around, that Noah did walk out and see just a devastated earth. And
absolutely. Even Mount St. Helens, for example, in Spirit Lake, right beside Mount St. Helens today, there are thousands of trees that got dumped into Spirit Lake that are still bobbing around. So again, I don't think people, I would so love for there to be a professionally made movie about Noah's flood and depicting it.
So you
in
didn't
a way.
Like what was that, Gerard Butler or whatever, whoever did that? Russell Crowe.
Russell Crowe, yeah.
You didn't like that one, eh?
No, we didn't think it was a good representation biblically.
Didn't get the Answers in Genesis stamp on that one.
No. Because I think then it would make people understand. This is the first time God judged the planet.
That's right.
It wasn't pretty. It's like Tim Hawkins says, in the kids library, you see Noah's Ark, and it's, but it's not some guy clinging to a rock screaming for his life.
That's a good point.
And those types of things. So floating log mats, groupings of trees, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that would have been floating around flotsam and jetsam after the flood for sure.
All right, let's keep going here.
Sure.
Next question is, throughout the series, you have alluded to the idea that mankind was not primitive back then. What kind of technology do you think they had, and is there evidence for this in the text and in the fossil archaeological record?
Right. Well, obviously, the text. There's good evidence right there in the beginning, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you get, right off the bat, you have Cain and Abel, and immediately you have one who's cultivating the land, the other who's a farmer. So you're getting animal husbandry, you're getting domestication, you're getting farming right off the bat. Right. When it gets into Cain, it talks about his children, some who worked with metal, some who made musical instruments. So you already have art, right? And this is just one generation removed from Adam and Eve's expulsion from Eden. So already you have the creating of art and working with metal and all kinds of stuff. Yeah,
working with metal. I mean, people need to think this through, right? You go, they're farming. Okay, so what are they using? Even a hoe, right? Yeah. Where do you get? Well, I go to Canadian Tire, right? Yeah. But think about making a musical instrument. Like if someone gave me $1 million and said, okay, Cal, you got to go out there and you got to pull some rocks out of the ground, and then you got to make some kind of furnace, and you got to melt that down. You got to get the right alloy because certain things, and then you got to bend that metal and shit. I'm sorry,
you lost me.
I don't have that capacity. They're doing this right off the bat.
Yeah,
God created people with full intelligence. I truly believe that the intelligence of we've had genetic decline now for many generations. Yep. And so, there's more than enough textual evidence to back that up. I did an article years ago. I think I titled it something like, "Hey Japheth, don't forget to turn off the computer." And I was trying to, because people have asked this kind of question. Well, how much technology do you think they would have gotten to, right? Because you're talking 1,650 years. Yeah. If you look at the technological advances within the last 300 years on this planet,
totally,
right? And you really think that through, you're like, wow, we went from like no cars to now we got cars Teslas. With computer to Teslas. Yeah, it's incredible, right? Yeah. But the real thing you need in order to create technology and advancing technology is you need shared information and protected information. Right? And so what you need is police forces and standing armies, because just read throughout the Old Testament. You get conquered, what's the first thing you do? You waste the guys' libraries. You destroy all their knowledge. You kill their cultures.
That's right.
That's what they did. Yep. So, today we stand on the shoulders of giants and we continue and we go, wow, we're really smart. But the thing is, I don't know anything about how my smartphone actually works personally. I have no clue. Yeah. I get the concept of the internet, but I'm like, when I really think about it, I'm like, no. So we think we're smart, but we're relying on a phone that's called a smartphone. So we should think that through. But anyway, so that's the thing. Did they have high technology? Obviously, because Noah built a giant ark, which would have taken a lot of craftsmanship. But do I think they had laptops on the ark? No.
Right.
Because if you've got a violent world where, all the stuff is going along and people are doing back then what they did even after the flood, which is destroying libraries and stuff. I don't think it was until this point in time when really you had a Christianized Western world that had some, I know we went through World War I and World War II, but England didn't get wasted. Devastated. The U.S. did not get devastated. The information was there. As a matter of fact, it drove technology at that time because of the war efforts and stuff like that. And that technology was kept and built upon. So I think they had a high level of technology, but I wouldn't say laptops and stuff like that for sure. So in my article, I talked about a device that had been found. So I'll just read this part. It'll further the point. So they found this device made somewhere between 150 BC and 100 BC, discovered in a shipwreck in 1901 off the Greek island of Antikythera. And so this device, they said, was just extraordinary, and the mechanics would just make your jaw drop, et cetera, et cetera. But what it was an analog computer. And it had a differential gear common that we see in automobiles today. So this is why the discovery of this device just blew their minds, because the intricacy of this thing is compared to an 18th century clock. But the point that they made, and this is directly from the article, the greater question puzzling scientists is how such a useful device could have disappeared entirely from the archaeological record, so much so that no record of anything as complex appears for another 1,000 years. See, they created that way back then, but there's no evidence that there was anything until now. And so we think, until we found that device, there's no evidence of those people being that smart. Oh, no, they actually had an analog computer.
Right.
They used gear systems like we use in modern automobiles. But until you make the discovery, we think, we're getting smarter as time goes on. No, they had that technology back then.
Right.
So here's just an example that we can use to point that kind of thing out to people.
And people, this is just a kind of tag on a theological point here, is this is one of the reasons, and there's lots of other reasons, I won't get into all of them, but one of the reasons God has even his people devastate the culture of some of the cultures that they're driving out of the promised land is because the technological advancements, the knowledge that would have been accumulated in those cultures were wicked, were evil, right? And so God is devastating a culture that's wicked as well, which is what he does in Noah's flood. But that idea that a culture would be destroyed rather than standing on the shoulders of the giants, as you alluded to, is a very interesting one.
Yep.
Okay. Do you have more to say on that?
No, that's great. I think we're hitting the right time, because I think this is the last of the questions.
Yes, it is. So in Calvin's talk, he said that he believed in dragons. Nate has said the same, and that the Nephilim were giants. Does the fossil record support a widespread belief in dragons, giants, etc.?
Right. So when I saw the question, just the way it was phrased, I don't know for sure, but a lot of times when you just use the word dragon or giants, we get this kind of fantasy world type
totally
image
Lord of
in
the
our
Rings,
head. So a giant,
smog,
a 30-foot tall person or a dragon, that kind of thing. And so both in our presentations, Answers in Genesis has always made this equation between dragons being what we now call dinosaurs.
Right.
So it's what people saw in history, because people groups from around the world have in their historical narratives that their ancestors saw these huge reptilian beasts, right? And so in the Bible, you see many, you look up the King James Version of the Bible, go to Bible Gateway, for example, type in keyword dragon, then you see often it's referenced as just dragon generically, and not simply as an allusion to Satan. It's like the dragon and the owl in the wilderness or whatever it was, right? So when we say dragon, that's what we're talking about. These, we've got physical representations with bones of these creatures. We just say what we now call dinosaurs were the dragons. As far as the giants, the 3rd chapter of Deuteronomy contains this story of the king of the Amorites, Og, right, and the king of Bashan, and we learned some interesting details about Og, right? I'm sure you've looked into this. And he's got a bed. We don't know if it was his bed or it was his coffin or whatever. But anyway, it's 9 cubits in length and 4 cubits in width. Well, that's about 13 and a half feet long and 6 feet wide. So whatever it was, he was placed on it or he slept on it or whatever like that. Now, I'm 6'1", and I sleep in a bed that's longer than 6'1", because I don't want my feet sticking out over the edge and stuff like that. But if you think of the size of this guy, right? 10 feet tall. I mean, Goliath was 9.5 feet tall. Right. So is there indications of giants in the Bible? Well, yeah, but we're not talking about a 30-foot tall or 100-foot tall. We're not talking Godzilla here.
Right.
We're talking about a giant person and compared to the average person that was at the time. Interesting, I went to a basketball game on Sunday with my grandson and my son-in-law. And, you first come in, we had courtside seats. It was awesome. And we're sitting there and I'm watching the guys, and then one of them passed in front of me and I'm like all of a sudden and you realize, man, that guy's a tall guy, and they're bouncing the ball and I'm looking at them, basketball to me, I hold it like this and they're just holding it like this. And you start to get that scale. Or I remember one time watching a mixed martial artist fighters and a fellow named Bob Sapp, and he went up against a guy named Nogueira, and they're in the corners of the ring, and as they enter and they meet inside, because not only, if you stand next to like Shaquille O'Neal or something like that, I've never, but you stand next to a big guy, not only do you notice the height, but just the girth. It's just...
But you can even see this in Rocky IV, right? When Rocky Balboa stands in front of Ivan Drago and it's like, how's that guy going to take him out? But,
exactly. But I mean, Sylvester Stallone is actually, he's not super tall. But when you stand next to a man who's, over 7 feet, you're just like, whoa, this is really weird. So the thing is, people in the past, I believe, not only cognitively were superior, but I believe a lot of them were
physically
more robust physically as well. And so this could just be referring to a group of people that were quite large. I think of like, you ever see Samoan wrestlers? Some of those guys just like, they've got a certain body type, right? Like The Rock, right? He's got kind of his ancestry and stuff like that. So this could just be referring to a group of large people. Where it gets a little tricky is when you insert the word Nephilim.
Yes.
And I'm sure when you went through that passage, you found that there was theologians all over the map and such. And so at Answers in Genesis, of course, we recognize that there's kind of 3 main camps that have come down. You preached on a specific interpretation, which is pretty well supported by a lot of the older theologians.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
And anyway, one of the things people should understand is the word Nephilim, we don't know exactly what it means. Kind of, fallen one, or that's,
or
we look at
seed of the fallen one, perhaps.
There's some derivatives there in the Hebrew, but in Genesis 6, there's no reference to the Nephilim being giants.
That's right.
The reference to them being giants kind of comes through the Greek Septuagint.
Yes.
So the Greek version, a Greek version of the Old Testament, where when the translators came to the word Nephilim, they didn't know what to do with it. They inserted the word gigentes, which is Greek for giants.
That's right.
So there's no direct allusion to giants, the Nephilim being giants. But then in the report, when the boys go out and look into the promise and they come back, they give this report and they say, well, there's these Nephilim, they were like grasshoppers in their eyes and stuff. And so people have gotten a bit confused. So
And I think one of the things to note is that in the actual text in Genesis 6, it talks about the Nephilim, and it doesn't say that they were giants. It says that in the original text, what it says is that they were men of renown, right? And so the interpretation that I preached on, the interpretation that I think is most faithful to the text, is the idea that the Nephilim are the spawns of this celestial human intermarriage. I think that's well supported in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1-4, and the way that the word Ben Elohim, which is sons of God, is used elsewhere in Scripture. But whatever you have these renowned men. You have these sort of heroes of old, right? And so whatever they were, whether it was their physical stature that was impressive, or what they accomplished, or the way in which people thought of them, something is renowned about them, but it doesn't necessarily say. I agree with you, and I think actually a lot of us think that the name of the giant that David slew was named Goliath. But if you actually look at the text, there's a few Goliaths that show up in the Old Testament narrative. And it seems, if you look into it, that Goliath is not a proper name, but Goliath is actually a title, that within the Philistine army, that the Goliaths were these large men, right? So 9 feet tall, right? Again, not 30 feet tall, but 9 feet tall. And I wouldn't want to fight a guy who's 9 foot tall. That's why we have weight classes and such in mixed martial arts nowadays. But but the idea here is that throughout human history, there's been variants of all kinds. You talked about the variants of people that we have on record.
That's right.
And so I think what we're seeing here is that throughout human history, there are all kinds of shapes and sizes to the people in which God created. I do think that we have to, as Christians, believe what the text says. So we believe in people who are 9.5 feet tall, because that's what the text tells us.
And we've got people today that reach close to those.
Pretty close, absolutely. And also remember, as you said, genetic mutations, the effects of sin, the shorter lifespans. There's all kinds of things that could be factors into that.
Exactly.
But I would say, we do. There is a supernatural text in front of us, and there are logical explanations for it. But we have to start with the text, believe what the text says, and then dig into it. So it might seem fantastic when it says, Nate and Cal believe in dragons. Yes, we do, but we believe in dragons because we believe in dinosaurs, and we believe that there are these reptilian monsters, and we think that there are reasons for their extinction, perhaps. But I'm with you in that, it's interesting. If you look at even the Chinese zodiac, you have all these animals, and you have this one mythological creature, right?
Right.
And accounts throughout history, various cultures, various times, various places who have this mythology of these giant lizards, and if those stories are to be believed, some of them either reflect history, our history, or have evolved from history. The idea is that not only was it sort of a prestigious thing to slay a dragon, but you think of what
St. George and the Dragon.
Exactly. You also think what one thing humans do is we eliminate threats. And if these giant reptiles are threats to they would go out on a hunting party. So it's not unfeasible to think that these things became extinct simply because, as humans went around the world, we eliminate other threats.
Yeah, and as I alluded to in our first Q&A too, dinosaurs were a unique creature. And there may have been factors that we don't know because of the soft tissue that we haven't been able to study that contributed to them being more susceptible, let's say, climate variations or things like that afterwards as well. It was interesting as far as the giants go. When Angela and I went to England, and we went to some of the cathedrals, and you go to the Tower of London, and you see some of the sizes of the weapons some of these guys used to. And I'm looking at the armor, and I'm thinking, I could never wield a sword that big. This must have been a massive.
I feel like David putting on Saul's armor, right? Like that's
exactly. And I you think of the David and Goliath account. I want a sling. I want some distance between me and this guy because he's got a spear that weighs a lot. And, how far can he hurl that thing and so on. So anyway.
You think of the fight in Princess Bride between Andre the Giant and the man in Wesley, right? Man in Black. And he says, "Why do you keep moving?" And he's just like, "Because I don't want you to catch me."
That's right. Exactly. Well, this was a lot of fun, Nate.
Yeah, it was.
You still got a ways to go.
We might end up doing another Q&A if lots more questions come in. But this was fun. I hope it was of practical help to people, and certainly, if nothing else, this ought to point you to the vast resource that Answers in Genesis is. And I think it's a great resource and it's a great ministry. And so this being put out on your channel and on our channel will hopefully direct more people to if you want to dig in, these answers are peripheral. There are whole papers and whole video series on each one of these that I would encourage you to go and look at.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much. We'll do it again.
Yeah, take care.